The envelope was thick and yellowed, sealed with old tape that looked like it had been sitting in a drawer for decades. Nurse Amy White pressed it into my hands with trembling fingers and said the words that would haunt me forever. "Your father made me promise to give this to you after he passed, but he was very clear. Do not open this envelope alone. Find someone you trust to be with you." But I didn't listen. 3 hours after my father, David Cooper, died in that sterile hospital room in Chicago, I sat alone in my apartment and tore open that envelope anyway. What I found inside destroyed everything I thought I knew about my life and revealed a truth so shocking that it sent my entire world spinning into chaos. My name is Ashley Cooper, and I'm 30 years old. For my entire life, I believed I was the daughter of David and Carol Cooper, a quiet couple who ran a small accounting firm on the south side of Chicago. I worked as a graphic designer for a marketing agency downtown, lived in a cozy one-bedroom apartment in Lincoln Park, and had what I considered a normal, if somewhat solitary, life. David had been battling pancreatic cancer for 8 months, and I'd spent countless hours at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, watching the man I called my father slowly fade away. He'd always been a quiet, serious person, but during his final weeks, he'd become increasingly agitated and secretive. He would have whispered conversations with nurses when he thought I wasn't listening, and he'd ask strange questions about whether I remembered anything from my earliest childhood. "Do you ever wonder about your baby years, Ashley?" he'd asked me just 2 days before he died. Sometimes people block out traumatic memories from when they're very young. I'd assumed he was just confused from the pain medication, rambling about random thoughts, as sick people often do. I had no idea he was trying to prepare me for the most devastating revelation of my life. Carol, my mother, had been strangely absent during David's final week. She claimed she couldn't handle seeing him so sick, which seemed odd for a woman who'd been married to him for over 30 years. When I tried to get her to visit him one last time, she became defensive and angry, saying things like, "Some people process grief differently," and "You don't understand the complexity of our relationship." Nurse Amy White had been David's primary caregiver during his final days, and she'd developed a genuine fondness for him. Amy was in her late 40s, a kind woman with graying hair and gentle eyes, who'd been working in oncology for 15 years. She'd seen hundreds of patients pass away, but something about David's case had affected her deeply. "Your father was carrying a heavy burden," Amy had told me the day before he died. "He kept saying he needed to make things right before it was too late. He was terrified about something, but he wouldn't tell me what it was." Amy explained that David had given her the envelope 3 days earlier, along with very specific instructions about when and how to deliver it to me. The weight of that envelope in my hands felt significant, like it contained more than just paper and ink. David had been insistent that I not open it alone, which made me think it contained bad news about his finances or maybe information about debts he'd hidden from our family. I figured I was strong enough to handle whatever financial problems he'd left behind. I was completely wrong. What that envelope contained wasn't about money or debts. It was about the fundamental truth of who I really was and how I'd come to be David and Carol Cooper's daughter. Growing up as David and Carol Cooper's daughter in Chicago had always felt slightly off-kilter, though I could never put my finger on exactly why. We lived in a modest 2-story house in the Bridgeport neighborhood, where David ran his small accounting practice from a converted basement office, and Carol worked part-time as a bookkeeper for local businesses. My childhood had been quiet and structured, but there were always strange gaps in our family history that I'd learned not to question. We had no extended family. David claimed his parents had died when he was young, and Carol said she'd been estranged from her relatives since before I was born. There were no baby pictures of me before the age of 2, which Carol explained by saying they'd been lost in a basement flood. I'd always felt like an outsider in my own family. David and Carol were both short and stocky with dark hair and brown eyes, while I was tall and slender with light brown hair and green eyes. When I'd ask about the physical differences as a child, Carol would get defensive and say things like, "You got your looks from David's side of the family," or "genetics work in mysterious ways." School had been my refuge. I was naturally artistic and excelled in creative subjects, though David and Carol never seemed particularly interested in my talents. They attended parent-teacher conferences and school events, but always with a detached politeness that made me feel like they were going through the motions rather than celebrating my achievements. During my teenage years, I'd started asking more questions about our family history, but my inquiries were always met with vague answers or subject changes. When I wanted to research our family tree for a high school project, Carol became almost panicked, insisting that our family records had been lost and that some things were better left in the past. David's cancer diagnosis had brought us closer together than we'd ever been. For the first time in my life, he seemed genuinely interested in spending time with me, asking about my work, my relationships, and my dreams for the future. But there was also an undercurrent of desperation in his attention, like he was trying to memorize everything about me or make up for lost time. During his chemotherapy treatments, David would sometimes stare at me with an expression I couldn't decipher, part love, part guilt, and part fear. When I'd catch him looking at me that way, he'd quickly turn away or change the subject. I assumed he was just processing his mortality and thinking about all the things he'd miss after he was gone. Carol's behavior during David's illness had been increasingly strange. She rarely visited the hospital, claiming that seeing David so sick was too emotionally difficult for her. When she did come, she seemed nervous and uncomfortable, like she was afraid of what David might say in front of me. There were several occasions when I walked into his room to find them having intense, whispered conversations that would stop abruptly when they noticed me. My work as a graphic designer had suffered during David's illness, but my boss at the marketing agency had been understanding about my need for flexible schedules and time off. I'd been with the company for 5 years and had built a reputation for creative, thoughtful design work that helped small businesses establish their brand identities. My personal life had always been somewhat isolated. I'd had a few serious relationships, but nothing that led to marriage or long-term commitment. I'd always attributed this to being naturally independent, but looking back, I wonder if some part of me was unconsciously searching for something I couldn't name, a sense of belonging or connection that I'd never found in my own family. The apartment I'd been renting in Lincoln Park was small, but comfortable, filled with my artwork and design projects. I'd created a space that felt authentically mine in ways that my childhood home never had. My neighbors were friendly, and I'd developed casual friendships with people in my building, but I'd never formed the deep, lasting connections that seemed to come naturally to others. During David's final week, I'd taken leave from work to be with him full-time. I'd noticed that he seemed to be waiting for something or working up the courage to tell me something important. Several times, he'd start to speak and then stop himself, looking conflicted and afraid. 3 hours after David's death, I sat alone in my Lincoln Park apartment with that mysterious envelope, trying to process the grief of losing the only father I'd ever known. The envelope felt heavier than it should have, and David's warning through Nurse Amy echoed in my mind. Do not open this envelope alone. But I was emotionally drained, physically exhausted, and desperate for closure. I'd spent months watching David deteriorate, and I needed to understand what had been weighing so heavily on his conscience during his final weeks. Against my better judgment, and despite the nurse's warning, I carefully opened the sealed envelope and pulled out its contents. What I found inside made my hand shake so violently that I dropped everything onto my coffee table. There were official documents, old newspaper clippings, photographs, and a handwritten letter from David that began with the words, "Ashley, I am not your biological father, and Carol is not your biological mother. We took you when you were 18 months old, and we've been living a lie ever since." The documents included a birth certificate with my picture, but a completely different name, Emma Rose Adams, and different parents listed, Jennifer and Brian Adams of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. There were hospital records, police reports, and newspaper articles about a missing toddler who had vanished from a Milwaukee playground in 1993. The missing child was me. David's letter, written in his careful handwriting, explained everything with devastating detail. In 1993, he and Carol had been struggling with infertility and growing desperate to have a child. They'd been rejected by adoption agencies due to Carol's history of mental health issues and David's financial instability. Carol had become obsessed with having a baby and had begun talking about taking matters into their own hands. According to David's confession, Carol had been watching families at playgrounds around the Midwest, looking for opportunities to take a child. On a summer afternoon in Milwaukee, she'd found me playing alone while my mother, Jennifer, was distracted by my older siblings. Carol had simply picked me up and walked away, and by the time anyone realized I was missing, we were already back in Chicago. Carol convinced me it was meant to be, David wrote in his letter. She said God had put you in our path because you were supposed to be our daughter. I was weak and scared, and I went along with her plan instead of doing the right thing. By the time I realized how wrong we were, you'd been with us for months, and I couldn't bear the thought of losing you. The newspaper clippings showed the massive search effort that had been launched to find me. My real parents, Jennifer and Brian Adams, had organized volunteers, worked with police, and never stopped looking for their missing daughter. There were photos of them at press conferences, holding pictures of me as a toddler, begging for information about their stolen child. The most heartbreaking part was reading about my real siblings, Katie and Jason Adams, who had been 7 and 11 when I disappeared. The articles described how the family had been torn apart by my kidnapping, how they'd moved multiple times hoping for fresh starts, and how they'd never given up hope of finding me. David's letter continued with details about how they'd created my new identity. Carol had connections through her previous work at a hospital, and they'd managed to obtain false documents that established me as Ashley Cooper, born in Chicago. They'd moved to a different neighborhood, told people Carol had been pregnant, and created an entirely fictional history for our family. Every day for 29 years, I've lived with the guilt of what we did to you and to your real family, David wrote. I wanted to tell you the truth so many times, but Carol threatened to hurt herself if I ever revealed our secret. She became completely convinced that you were always meant to be our daughter, and she couldn't accept that we'd stolen you from people who loved you. The final page of David's letter included contact information for Detective Mike Garcia, who had worked on my original missing persons case and was now retired. David had been secretly in contact with Detective Garcia for the past year, providing information that would help reunite me with my real family after his death. I'm dying, Ashley, and I can't take this secret with me to my grave, David concluded. You deserve to know who you really are, and your real family deserves to know that you're alive and safe. I'm sorry for the pain this will cause you, but the truth is, the only gift I can give you now. Sitting alone in my apartment, surrounded by the evidence of my stolen life, I realized that everything I thought I knew about myself was a lie. My name, my family, my entire identity, none of it was real. After reading David's confession letter 3 times and studying every document in that envelope, I made a decision that would change my life forever. Instead of calling a friend or family member for support, instead of waiting until morning to process this information, I got in my car and drove directly to Carol's house in Bridgeport at 11 o'clock at night. Carol was still awake when I arrived, sitting in the living room where I'd spent my childhood, surrounded by the photos and mementos of what I now knew was a completely fabricated family life. When she opened the door and saw the envelope and documents in my hands, her face went completely white. "You opened it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "David promised me he would never tell you. He swore to me that he would take our secret to his grave." I walked into the house I'd grown up in and looked around with new eyes. Every family photo on the walls was a lie. Every birthday celebration, every Christmas morning, every moment of what I'd believed was love and security had been built on the foundation of a terrible crime. "My name is Emma Adams," I said, my voice steady, despite the rage building inside me. "I have real parents named Jennifer and Brian Adams who have been searching for me for 29 years. You kidnapped me from a playground in Milwaukee when I was 18 months old." Carol collapsed into her favorite armchair, the same chair where she'd read me bedtime stories and helped me with homework for years. "You don't understand," she said, tears streaming down her face. "You were meant to be our daughter. When I saw you playing alone at that playground, I knew God had put you there for me to find. Your real parents weren't watching you properly. You could have been hurt." The audacity of her justification made my hands shake with anger. "You stole me from my family," I said. "You destroyed their lives and built our entire relationship on a lie. How could you look at me every day for 29 years, knowing what you'd done?" Carol tried to reach for my hand, but I pulled away. "Ashley, honey, please sit down so we can talk about this calmly," she said, still using the fake name she'd given me. David was sick and confused. He didn't know what he was saying. "You are our daughter. We raised you. We loved you. We gave you everything you needed." But I was done listening to her lies and justifications. I pulled out my phone and called Detective Mike Garcia, whose contact information David had included in his letter. Even though it was late at night, the detective answered immediately, as if he'd been waiting for this call. "Detective Garcia, my name is Emma Adams," I said, watching Carol's face crumple as she realized I was choosing my real identity over the false one she'd created. "I believe you worked on a missing persons case in 1993. I just found out that I'm the child you've been looking for." Detective Garcia's voice was filled with emotion when he replied, "Emma, we've been waiting for this call for almost 30 years. Are you safe? Do you need immediate protection?" I explained where I was and what I'd discovered, and Detective Garcia said he would contact current Chicago police immediately to take Carol into custody. While we waited for the police to arrive, Carol made one last desperate attempt to maintain the lie that had defined our relationship. "Ashley, please don't do this to our family," she begged. "Think about all the happy memories we've shared. Think about how much David and I loved you. Your biological parents probably forgot about you years ago and moved on with their lives. But I'd seen the newspaper articles about my real family's decades-long search. I knew they'd never stopped looking for me or forgotten about their missing daughter. My real name is Emma Adams, I said firmly. I'm 30 years old. I live in Chicago, and I'm coming home to my real family. When the police arrived 20 minutes later, I handed over all the evidence David had left for me and watched as Carol was arrested for kidnapping, child abduction, and identity fraud. As they led her away in handcuffs, she was still calling me Ashley and begging me to remember all the love she'd given me over the years. That night, I called my real parents for the first time in 29 years. When Jennifer Adams answered the phone at her home in Milwaukee, and I said, "My name is Emma Adams, and I think I'm your daughter," the sound of her sobs through the phone told me that David's letter had been true. I was finally going home to the family that had never stopped searching for me. The reunion with my real family took place 3 days later at a hotel conference room in Milwaukee, with Detective Mike Garcia and current investigators present to document everything and ensure my safety. I'd spent those 3 days in a hotel in Chicago, afraid to go home to my apartment because news media had gotten hold of the story and were camping outside my building. Walking into that conference room and seeing Jennifer and Brian Adams for the first time was the most emotionally overwhelming moment of my life. Jennifer was tall and slender with light brown hair and green eyes. I finally understood where my physical traits had come from. Brian was equally tall with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor that immediately felt familiar, though I couldn't access any actual memories of them from my toddler years. But it was meeting my siblings, Katie and Jason, that broke me completely. Katie was 28 now, just 2 years younger than me, and she looked so much like me that we could have been twins. Jason was 32 and had my same eye color and facial structure. They'd grown up as the middle child and oldest child, respectively, never knowing their sister Emma, who should have been the middle child. "We never stopped looking for you," Katie said through tears as she hugged me for the first time since we were toddlers. "Every birthday, every Christmas, every family gathering, there was always an empty space where you should have been. Mom and Dad kept your bedroom exactly the same for 10 years. Hoping you'd come home." Jason showed me a photo album they'd maintained for 29 years, filled with pictures of what my life should have been. There were photos from family vacations I'd never taken, birthday parties I'd never attended, and milestones I'd never shared with them. They'd included empty spaces in family photos where I should have been standing. And they'd written annual letters to me on my birthday, even though they didn't know if I was alive or dead. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of David and Carol's crime and cover-up. Detective Garcia explained that he'd worked my missing persons case for 15 years before retiring, and he'd never given up hope of finding me. When David contacted him a year earlier, claiming to have information about Emma Adams, Detective Garcia had been skeptical, but hopeful. "Your father, David Cooper, reached out to me when he was first diagnosed with cancer," Detective Garcia explained. "He said he had information about a missing child from 1993, but he was terrified about the consequences of coming forward. It took him months to work up the courage to tell me the whole truth. The most shocking revelation was that there had been a massive police cover-up in the original investigation. Carol Cooper had worked as a nurse at a hospital in 1993, and she'd had connections with several police officers who had helped create false documents and misdirect the investigation away from Chicago. 3 retired officers were arrested on charges of obstruction of justice and conspiracy to commit kidnapping. My real parents explained how the kidnapping had destroyed their marriage initially, but they'd eventually reconciled and rebuilt their relationship around their shared determination to find me. They'd hired private investigators, worked with missing children organizations, and never moved from Milwaukee because they wanted me to be able to find them if I ever escaped or remembered my real identity. We knew you were probably being raised by someone who called themselves your parents, Jennifer explained. We hoped that whoever had you was at least treating you well, but we never stopped believing that someday you'd learn the truth and come home to us. The emotional complexity of the situation was overwhelming. I felt simultaneously grateful to be reunited with my real family and devastated about the life I'd been stolen from. I'd missed 29 years of birthdays, holidays, graduations, and family memories that could never be recovered. Katie had gotten married 2 years earlier, and I'd missed being her maid of honor. Jason had 2 young children who were my niece and nephew, but I was a complete stranger to them. But there was also incredible joy in discovering that I had a family who'd been searching for me my entire life. The artistic talents that had always seemed out of place in the Cooper household were actually inherited traits. Both Jennifer and Katie were painters, and Jason worked as an architect. The sense of being different or disconnected that I'd felt my entire life suddenly made perfect sense. Carol's trial revealed the extent of her mental illness and obsession with having a child. She'd been declared incompetent to stand trial initially, but eventually pleaded guilty to kidnapping and child abduction charges. She was sentenced to 25 years in prison, though she continued to insist that she'd saved me from neglectful parents and given me a better life. The hardest part was reconciling my feelings about David Cooper. His deathbed confession had given me back my real identity and reunited me with my family. But it had also revealed that the man I'd called father for 29 years had been complicit in stealing me from people who loved me. I felt grateful and betrayed simultaneously. The first year after discovering my real identity was the most challenging and transformative period of my life. I legally changed my name back to Emma Rose Adams and began the complex process of building relationships with family members I'd been stolen from as a toddler. Jennifer, Brian, Katie, and Jason were incredibly patient and understanding, but we were essentially strangers trying to create familial bonds that should have developed naturally over decades. I decided to move back to Milwaukee to be closer to my real family, leaving behind my life in Chicago and the career I'd built there. My real parents helped me find a new apartment just 15 minutes from their house, and I gradually began spending holidays and weekends with siblings who were eager to include me in their lives, but didn't quite know how to relate to someone they'd missed for so long. The media attention around my case was intense, but ultimately positive. My story helped shine light on cold cases involving missing children and led to renewed investigations in several similar cases across the country. 3 other families were reunited with children who'd been kidnapped and raised under false identities, thanks to tips that came in after my story was publicized. Carol Cooper was eventually sentenced to 25 years in federal prison for kidnapping, child abduction, conspiracy, and identity fraud. I attended her sentencing hearing, where she was given the opportunity to make a statement. Even then, she continued to insist that she'd acted out of love and had given me a good life that I should be grateful for. "I saved you from parents who weren't watching you properly," Carol said during her statement, looking directly at me. "I gave you 29 years of love and care that you'll never get from anyone else. You'll realize someday that I was the real mother you needed." But I'd learned the difference between love and possession, between care and control. Real love doesn't require stealing someone from their family and building a relationship on lies. Carol's version of love had been selfish and destructive, motivated by her own needs rather than my well-being. David Cooper's role in my kidnapping remained complicated for me to process. His deathbed confession had ultimately reunited me with my family, but it had come 29 years too late. I struggled with feeling both grateful and angry toward him, understanding that he'd been weak rather than evil, but knowing that his weakness had cost me decades with my real family. The legal resolution of my case took 2 years and involved testimony from dozens of witnesses, including the retired police officers who'd helped cover up the crime. The corruption in the original investigation was extensive, involving falsified reports, misdirected resources, and deliberate obstruction of the search efforts. Several officers faced criminal charges, and the case led to reforms in how missing children cases are handled. My relationship with my real family grew stronger over time, though it required patience and understanding from everyone involved. Katie and I developed a close sisterly bond built around our shared artistic interests and similar personalities. Jason included me in his children's lives, and his kids began calling me Aunt Emma naturally and without confusion. Jennifer and Brian were careful not to overwhelm me with parental expectations, understanding that I'd lived 30 years as someone else's daughter. But gradually, we developed a warm, adult relationship that honored both the child they'd lost and the woman I'd become. They never tried to replace my memories of David Cooper, even though his actions had caused them unimaginable pain. I started a nonprofit organization called Stolen Voices that helps families of missing children navigate long-term searches and provides support for kidnapping survivors who are reunited with their families later in life. The organization also advocates for better training and protocols in missing children investigations to prevent the kind of corruption that had hidden my case for decades. The most important lesson I learned was that identity isn't just about names or genetics. It's about the connections we choose to build and maintain. While I'd been stolen from my real family, I was ultimately able to choose to return to them and rebuild relationships that had been interrupted by crime. I learned that it's possible to honor the complexity of loving people who've harmed you while also choosing to embrace the authentic connections you've been denied. Today, I carry both names, Emma Adams and Ashley Cooper, because both represent parts of who I am. But I live as Emma Adams, surrounded by the family that never stopped searching for me and never gave up hope that I'd come home. Sometimes the most devastating revelations lead to the most profound healing, and sometimes the truth, no matter how painful, is the only path to genuine freedom.